an outfitter from Casper, Wind Condit. That's Lori Markovitz. She's our executive director for our office administrator for Wyoming Outfitter Guide Association. That's her better half, Hank Alexander, who'll be doing the photographing. Dave, you want to tell everybody who you are?
Dave Sturm, Spur Ranch, Spur Out.
Chris Williams, Ian Ranch.
Tony Caraco, Bow Caps.
Nice to meet you. It'll be you next.
Oh, Roger, just traveling on through.
George Williams, ZN Outfitters. Tyler Sims from McFadden, Wyoming.
Deb Shell, Rough Country Outfitters.
She's hiding in the corner. She's got to escape real quick. Well, we'd like to thank everybody for coming. We did our first presentation in Afton the other night. We had 23 outfitters show up, so that was a pretty good attendance. We invited one of your representatives from Carbon County to show up, so I can't remember who it was. One of our Burkhardt, I think, our lobbyist asked, that's who she suggested. So anyway, we'll get started with this. Okay, this first question we'd like to ask you, raise of hands. How many of you heard about the 9010 HB 112 before WYOGA let you know about it? Okay, Dave and I talked on the phone. Anybody, other guys hear about this at all until you got the letter? Okay, that's good to know. What HB 112 was, it was a bill that was written by Bob Wharf, the executive director of the Sportsman for Fish and Wildlife. And we had Bob at our convention in Jackson, and he told us what his logic was for this bill. Actually, Bob's been talking to some of our members about this for 3 years, so I think Bob had planned on doing this at some point in time. And the reason that they said they introduced it last time was because there was a piece of legislation that was going to raise resident license fees by 10%. And they wanted to oppose that because they felt that that was unjust to raise license fees by 10% for resident hunters. So they introduced and wrote this bill as a way of counteracting that bill. And once that other bill was defeated, WYOGA members made a lot of phone calls, and we got this one withdrawn too. But what this slide will show you, and I think a lot of us know this already, that 74% of the license-related revenues come from non-resident hunters and anglers. And this is the Game and Fish's slice of the pie. It's 62% from non-resident hunting and non-resident fishing. And resident hunting is only 19%, resident fishing is 7%. I think most of us are pretty aware of that, but we want to make sure that everybody totally gets that as far as how important this non-resident dollar is. What we're trying to do tonight is we're trying to make sure that you guys understand the facts. So when you talk to resident sportsmen or people in the neighborhood and people you do business with, that they get the straight skinny on what a bill like this would actually do to the economy of Wyoming. These are the primary sponsors. Alan Yagi, who's from Lyman, Wyoming, he was probably the primary one, followed by this guy that's from your part of the world, Larry Hicks, Bags, Wyoming. Larry was very instrumental in writing this bill and being part of it. I've actually talked to my Casper representative, Bunky Laux. He was a representative, or he signed on and sponsored, and he didn't even know what I was talking about when I mentioned to him what he had signed on to. So I'm really not sure what's going on with these people. I guess some people just don't read what they sign on to, and they just go for it. So you guys who have an opportunity to talk to your representatives, especially Larry, it'll be a real good idea to let them know about what you're about to learn about HB 112 tonight. Okay, this is just a little review, and as we all, I think probably everybody in this room understands that bighorn sheep, mountain goat are 75-25 split, moose is 80-20, and then of course trophy game species over the counters, and we have the 40-60 split between special and regular. Now understand that this is state statute, okay? This is law. This is how licenses have to be issued for the 40-60 split and the bighorn sheep and mountain goat and moose. The elk licenses are an 84-16 in limited quota areas, and once the limited quota areas are all drawn out, the rest of the tags go to general license until they hit the 7250 cap. And that cap's been in place for well over 25 years in Wyoming. We're still sitting at that cap. And the deer and antelope are an 80-20 split. Now this is commission regulations, and this is important to let people know. If the Game and Fish Commission at any time feels like this number's out of whack, they can adjust these numbers up or down. And so they have the authority to do that. And a lot of people aren't aware that that is set by commission regulations. And they can be lobbied to go up or down with that. So the primary components of HB 112, basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to make it by state law that we would give 90% of all trophy licenses and big game licenses to the non-residents. And that included mountain lion and black bear, which we issue now over the counter. And if HB 112 would have passed, by law, they would have had to hold 90% of the licenses back for resident hunters. And there was no mechanism in that legislation either for leftover tags. It basically said 90% of the tags go to resident hunters. If you do the math on that, that's a 50% reduction in non-resident hunting opportunity. If you try to keep the Game and Fish at their current funding level, that would have increased resident hunting licenses by 250% for the money that we would have lost from the non-resident licenses. If you're trying to keep Game and Fish funding, that's a significant, huge number. And then last year they were fighting a 10% license fee increase. You can't imagine how the resident sportsman would scream about a 250% license fee increase. And that would be, like I said, to keep no net loss in the Game and Fish funding. This is a Game and Fish chart that we were given in Jackson. This is the chart that they worked up as soon as they had to do a fiscal impact. Whenever legislation comes up, they have to do all the agencies, whatever, if it's affecting them, they have to do a fiscal impact. So here is Antelope, and here's the number of non-resident special licenses that were sold in 13. Here's the number of regular licenses that were sold, and so this is the total number of non-resident licenses that were sold, and then the number of resident licenses that were sold. And a lot of people are going to say, well, that's really out of whack, but well, you guys live in a little bit different world down here. But if you go from Casper East, where it's predominantly private property, they don't kill big antelope in eastern Wyoming. And there's never been an appetite for those licenses amongst the resident sportsmen. Never has. You can go back to this business 25 years ago, and those tags never sold out. And a lot of people think it's because there's no access over there, and I would dispute that. I'd say it's because the big antelope in this state live on public land. You guys live in big antelope country down here, high demand license area. There's no demand for a license over by Newcastle, Wyoming. There's 12-inch antelope over there. And the resident hunters put in for these public land areas because that's where the best antelope hunting is. They don't drop, they don't care, they move on. And if we had to do our allocation to residents, and this is what we would have sold to non-residents at $3,320, which would have been a reduction of 11,986 licenses, or net loss of $3 million to the Wyoming Game and Fish. Now, the one number in here that's a little bit weird, you'll see it with the deer. The reason they did that is they only figured in the loss of revenue from limited quota deer tags, because our regional deer licenses, the Game and Fish had to look at those as if they were a general license. They didn't know how to calculate that with the impact that this bill would have had. So they have a fairly small revenue loss there, but that's the one thing that is really kind of askew here. And here's your elk number here, it would have been 1.6 million. And then of course the other thing that's huge is these cow-calf tags, dauphin antelope. They have been capped. They would have been huge numbers, reductions. So this number here, we know for a fact that if 90-10 would have passed, the Game and Fish would have been short almost $7 million just on deer, antelope, and elk. So the fiscal impact to them is significant. This isn't any other species. This is just this, and this is, like I said, this is the chart they had to prepare for the legislature when this bill came up. So keep that number in mind here. That's a huge number. Here's the Game and Fish slide. I was at the commission meeting in Lander when the Game and Fish was giving their presentation to the commission as to their projected revenues for fiscal year 15. So here's their gross amount that they project they'll bring in fiscal year 15, $70 million and some change. 54% of that comes from license fees. And of course, you saw from the previous slide, 74% of this is non-residents. So the Game and Fish relies heavily on non-resident dollars. And that is a huge amount of money that they would have to have another way of making up if they didn't have those license fees. Where do the licensed sales come from? Next one. They come from non-resident hunters. 62% come from non-resident hunters, 12% from non-resident fishing, and 19% from residents. You're gonna find out why. We're gonna have to play a little game before we get to that section. So 74% of license-related revenue comes from non-resident hunters and anglers. And it's the money makers are antelope, deer, and elk. So who's gonna fill this gap? If we cut out half the non-resident hunters, and their hunting opportunity's gone, 50% reduction, which is what 90-10 would have done, we're gonna have to raise license fees by 250% to fill in this green gap. And so right now, the non-resident seems to be willing to pay it. There's more non-residents putting in for tags than we have licenses available for in a significant number of areas in the state. There's about 10,000 non-residents who were denied an elk license in Wyoming this year because they didn't draw. So they seem to be willing to foot the bill. I'm not sure who's going to pay this if we don't have those in the state of Wyoming. We don't have the non-resident. So we know HB 112 and the 90-10 would have cut for, at the very minimum, $6.7 million in license revenue to the game and fish. And another thing to keep in mind, that number that they showed us there was just figuring everything on regular license fees, no specials, and it didn't include any of the trophy game species or the mountain lion or black bears. It was just strictly deer, antelope, and elk. Okay, this is going to be a little fun one. George, how many resident big game hunters live in the state of Wyoming? If you don't know a number, give me a percentage of the state of Wyoming that hunts big game.
40%?
40%? What do you say?
I was gonna say 5.
5%?
Yeah.
Anybody else got a guess? What would you say, Dave?
5%.
When I was at the Wyoming Association Tax Service, I asked this question, and